In the spring of 1204, the defenders of Constantinople watched in horror as a massive wooden arm swung through the air. A 300-pound stone crashed into the ancient walls that had protected the city for 800 years. The impact sent shockwaves through the fortifications, and fragments of stone rained down on the soldiers below. Some died instantly, crushed beneath the rubble. Others weren't so lucky. The shockwave from the impact ruptured internal organs, leaving men bleeding from their eyes and ears, their bodies unmarked but dying from the inside out. This was the power of the Trebuchet, a machine so devastating it would change warfare forever. But within 2 centuries, even this fearsome weapon would become obsolete, replaced by something far more terrifying. This is the story of medieval siege warfare, from the age of the trebuchet to the dawn of gunpowder. And I promise you, history books left out the darkest parts. Welcome to Ash and Crown History, where we uncover the stories that textbooks won't tell you. If you're fascinated by the brutal reality of medieval warfare and want to explore more of history's darkest chapters, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Now, let's dive into a world where castle walls offered no protection, and entire cities could be reduced to rubble by machines of war. The trebuchet didn't appear overnight. Its origins stretch back to ancient China, where traction trebuchets operated by teams of men pulling ropes were used as early as the 4th century. But the weapon that would terrorize medieval Europe was different. The counterweight trebuchet, developed sometime in the 12th century, was a marvel of engineering that turned simple physics into a weapon of mass destruction. Imagine a wooden beam, sometimes over 50 feet long, balanced on a sturdy frame. On one end, a sling held a projectile. On the other, a massive counterweight, often a wooden box filled with tons of stone, earth, or even lead. When the counterweight fell, it would whip the beam upward, and the sling would release its cargo in a devastating arc toward enemy fortifications. The physics were elegant, but the results were anything but. A well-constructed trebuchet could launch stones weighing 200 to 300 pounds over 300 yards with terrifying accuracy. The largest trebuchets, the monsters that required months to build and entire forests to construct, could throw projectiles exceeding half a ton. But siege engineers didn't just throw stones. They launched diseased animal carcasses over walls to spread plague among defenders. They hurled pots of burning pitch that would shatter on impact, spreading fire through wooden structures. They even launched the severed heads of captured soldiers, a psychological weapon designed to break the morale of those trapped inside. Let me take you to the Siege of Acre in 1291, one of the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land. The Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with an army of over 100,000 men and a train of siege engines that contemporary chroniclers described as numberless as the stars. Among these were massive trebuchets, some so large they required 100 oxen to transport in pieces. The Mamluks called their largest trebuchet the Victorious and another the Furious. These weren't just weapons. They were instruments of terror with names designed to crush hope. For 6 weeks, these trebuchets pounded the walls of Acre day and night. The noise alone was maddening. Defenders described the sound as continuous thunder, a relentless booming that made sleep impossible and drove men to the edge of madness. The stones didn't just break walls. They pulverized them. Each impact sent clouds of stone dust into the air, choking the defenders and covering the city in a gray shroud. Buildings collapsed not from direct hits, but from the constant vibration that weakened their foundations. And when the stones struck crowded defensive positions, the carnage was indescribable. Limbs were torn from bodies. Men were crushed into unrecognizable pulp. The lucky ones died instantly, but the psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical destruction. Imagine being a defender on those walls. You can see the trebuchet being loaded. You watch the crew adjust the angle. You know the stone is coming, but you don't know where it will hit. Some men broke under the stress, abandoning their posts. Others became catatonic, unable to move even as stones crashed around them. The Mamluks understood this. They deliberately varied their rate of fire, sometimes launching a barrage, then going silent for hours before resuming. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. When Acre finally fell, the slaughter was total. The Mamluks showed no mercy. Thousands were killed in the streets. Women and children were taken as slaves. The remaining Crusader knights made a last stand in the fortress, and when it became clear that surrender meant execution, they fought to the last man. The Mamluks were so determined to erase the Crusader presence that they systematically demolished the entire city. What the Trebuchets had damaged, men with hammers and picks finished. Within months, Acre was little more than rubble and memories. Now, you might wonder how defenders responded to these terrifying machines. The answer is they adapted, but adaptation came at a terrible cost. Castle architecture underwent a dramatic transformation in the 12th and 13th centuries, driven entirely by the threat of the trebuchet. Walls grew thicker, sometimes reaching 20 feet in width. Towers were redesigned with rounded profiles that would deflect projectiles rather than absorb their full impact. Moats were widened and deepened, pushing trebuchets further from their targets and reducing their accuracy. Some defenders built their own counter-trebuchets, mounting them on castle walls or towers. This led to bizarre artillery duels where siege engines on both sides would exchange fire, each trying to destroy the other. Historical accounts from the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 describe exactly this scenario. The defenders had built trebuchets inside the castle walls and used them to target the besiegers' siege engines. For weeks, the two sides lobbed stones at each other in a destructive stalemate. The noise must have been apocalyptic, the constant crash of stone on stone, the splintering of wooden frames, and the screams of men caught in the crossfire. But perhaps the most ingenious defense against trebuchets was the development of the tortoise, or testudo in Latin. These were mobile wooden shelters covered in wet hides or metal plates that could be wheeled up to the base of siege engines. Men hiding inside would attempt to set fire to the trebuchet or hack at its supporting framework. It was desperately dangerous work. The besiegers would rain down arrows, pour boiling oil, and sometimes drop stones directly onto these shelters. But occasionally it worked. At the siege of Carcassonne in 1240, defenders successfully destroyed 2 trebuchets using precisely this tactic, forcing the besiegers to pull their remaining engines back to safer distances. Yet, for all their power, trebuchets had significant limitations. They were slow to build, sometimes requiring weeks or months of labor by skilled carpenters and engineers. They were expensive, consuming vast quantities of timber and rope. They were vulnerable to weather. Heavy rain could damage the ropes or cause the wooden frame to warp, and they required constant maintenance. Ropes would stretch and snap. Counterweight boxes would crack and need reinforcement. The pivoting joints would wear down and require replacement. A siege train might arrive with a dozen trebuchets, but keeping even half of them operational throughout a long siege was a major accomplishment. And sieges could drag on for months, even years. The siege of Harlech Castle in Wales lasted 7 years. The defenders endured starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. Historical records suggest that by the end, they were surviving on rats, leather, and whatever grass grew between the stones. The psychological toll was immense. Men went mad. Some threw themselves from the walls rather than endure another day. When the castle finally fell, only a handful of defenders remained alive, skeletal figures barely capable of holding a sword. This brings us to a crucial turning point in our story. By the early 14th century, a new technology was emerging that would render the trebuchet obsolete and transform warfare forever. Gunpowder. The exact origins of gunpowder are murky, likely developed in China and transmitted to the Islamic world and then to Europe through trade routes and military encounters. Early gunpowder was unreliable, dangerous, and relatively weak. But it had one advantage that would prove revolutionary. It could propel projectiles without relying on mechanical energy. The first gunpowder weapons in Europe were crude tubes of bronze or iron, more likely to explode and kill their operators than to damage enemy fortifications. Historical records from the early 1300s describe weapons called pot de fer, literally iron pots, that used gunpowder to shoot large arrows. These were more terrifying than effective, producing enormous noise and clouds of smoke but doing little real damage. Defenders would often laugh at these early attempts, secure in their stone walls. But engineers learned quickly. By the 1320s, larger cannons called bombards were being cast. These were massive weapons, some weighing several tons, that fired stone balls rather than arrows. The early bombards were still dangerous to their crews. The metal was often of poor quality, riddled with imperfections that could cause the barrel to burst. Gunpowder mixtures were inconsistent, sometimes burning too slowly to generate sufficient pressure, other times detonating with such force that the cannon would shatter. Crews would light the powder and run, hoping the weapon would fire rather than explode. Yet despite these dangers, the bombard's potential was obvious. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the English army deployed several small cannons. While their military impact was minimal, the psychological effect was significant. The French cavalry had never heard such sounds, and their horses panicked at the noise and smoke. Chronicles describe knights being thrown from their mounts, trampled in the chaos, or simply riding away from the battlefield in terror. Let me take you to a moment that changed history. The year is 1453. The place is Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, protected by walls that had withstood countless sieges for over 1,000 years. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had assembled an army of over 80,000 men and a siege train that included something unprecedented. A monster cannon designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. This weapon, called Basilica, was over 27 feet long, weighed nearly 20 tons, and could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to transport it. Loading and firing it was a 4-hour process. But when it fired, the destruction was absolute. The first time Basilica discharged, the sound could be heard 10 miles away. The stone ball, moving at relatively low velocity compared to modern artillery, but carrying enormous kinetic energy due to its mass, struck the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. These walls were 15 feet thick, reinforced with rubble and concrete, and had stood for 1,000 years. The impact created a crater, fracturing the stonework and sending shockwaves through the entire section of wall. Defenders who were too close were killed by the concussion alone, their internal organs ruptured by the pressure wave. But Basilica had a fatal flaw. The enormous pressures generated by the gunpowder charge created intense heat. After just a few shots, the barrel became so hot that the gun crew had to pour water over it and wait hours for it to cool. There are accounts of the barrel glowing red after firing. Despite this limitation, Mem deployed dozens of smaller cannons alongside Basilica, creating a relentless barrage that pounded the walls day and night for 6 weeks. The defenders of Constantinople fought desperately. They repaired the walls at night, filling breaches with rubble and timber. They built inner walls behind the sections that were being destroyed. They made sorties to attack the cannons, sometimes successfully spiking them or killing the gun crews. But they were fighting against inevitability. The cannons weren't just destroying walls. They were destroying hope. Every day, more of the ancient fortifications crumbled. Every day, the Ottoman artillery grew more accurate and efficient. On May 29, 1453, after a massive artillery bombardment created a practicable breach in the walls, Ottoman forces launched their final assault. Thousands of soldiers poured through the gaps that cannons had torn in Constantinople's defenses. The city that had stood as a bastion of Christianity for over 1,000 years fell in a single day. The slaughter was horrific. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of unrestricted looting, and they took full advantage. Tens of thousands were killed. Churches were desecrated. Priceless libraries were burned. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, ceased to exist. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. If the mightiest walls in Christendom could fall to cannons, no fortification was safe. This realization sparked a revolution in military architecture. The era of the tall, thin castle wall was over. Engineers began designing a new type of fortification specifically engineered to withstand artillery fire. These new fortifications, which would come to be called star forts or tres Italiennes, represented a complete reimagining of defensive architecture. Instead of tall walls that presented large targets to artillery, these fortifications featured low, thick walls made of earth and stone. The walls were angled to deflect cannonballs rather than absorb their impact directly. Projecting bastions allowed defenders to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that attackers couldn't find dead zones where they'd be safe from defensive cannons. The entire design was based on geometry, with every angle calculated to maximize defensive advantage while minimizing vulnerability to artillery. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and the transition period was bloody. Castles built in the old style became death traps for their defenders. Let me tell you about the siege of Roxburgh Castle in 1460. The Scots brought cannons to attack this English-held fortress. The castle's walls, built 2 centuries earlier to withstand trebuchets and battering rams, were utterly inadequate against gunpowder artillery. The cannons punched through the stonework with ease. Defenders huddled in towers that became tombs when cannonballs brought entire sections crashing down. Those who survived the bombardment faced a terrifying choice: surrender and hope for mercy, or wait for the inevitable assault through the breaches. Many chose surrender. Those who didn't were killed when Scottish soldiers poured through the shattered walls. Ironically, King James II of Scotland, who had ordered the siege, was killed by one of his own cannons when it exploded during the bombardment. This was not uncommon. Early cannons were as dangerous to their crews as to the enemy. Historical records are filled with accounts of catastrophic failures. Barrels would split, sending metal shrapnel slicing through the gun crews. Gunpowder would detonate prematurely, incinerating anyone nearby. Even successful firing could be deadly. The recoil from these massive weapons could crush men if they didn't clear the area quickly enough. Yet despite these dangers, cannon technology advanced rapidly throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. Metallurgy improved, allowing for stronger barrels that could withstand higher pressures. Gunpowder formulas became more consistent, producing reliable explosive force. Cannons became more mobile, mounted on wheeled carriages that allowed them to be repositioned during battles. By the early 1500s, armies were deploying field artillery that could be moved and fired multiple times per day, a dramatic improvement over the static bombards of the previous century. The impact on warfare was profound. Medieval cavalry charges became suicidal. Pike formations were torn apart by cannonballs. And castle sieges, which had once taken months or years, could now be concluded in weeks or even days. The social implications were equally dramatic. The castle had been more than a military structure. It was a symbol of feudal power. A lord in his castle could resist even a king. But cannons democratized violence in a sense. A monarch with money to hire engineers and cast cannons could now humble any rebellious noble, no matter how strong their fortifications. This shift accelerated the centralization of power in the hands of kings and queens. The feudal system, already in decline, weakened further as castles lost their military relevance. Some nobles adapted, building new star forts at enormous expense. Others saw their ancient strongholds reduced to rubble by royal artillery. The Tudor conquest of Ireland in the 16th century provides a stark example. Irish lords had relied on castles that had protected them for centuries. English cannons demolished these fortifications with contemptuous ease, and with them Irish independence. But let's return to the battlefield itself and examine what artillery did to human bodies, because this is where history gets truly dark. A trebuchet stone would crush and mangle. A cannonball did something different. Early cannon shot was made of stone, just like trebuchet ammunition, but it moved differently. A trebuchet stone followed an arcing trajectory, dropping from above. A cannonball flew in a flatter trajectory with higher velocity. When it struck a formation of men, it didn't just kill those it hit directly. It would pass through multiple bodies, tearing limbs off, decapitating, eviscerating. Surgeons' accounts from the period describe wounds that were utterly untreatable. Men with their entire torsos crushed. Soldiers whose legs had been torn off at the hip, bleeding out in minutes. Heads simply vanishing, leaving behind bodies that stood for a moment before collapsing. And then there was the development of explosive shells. By the late medieval period, engineers had figured out how to pack gunpowder into hollow iron balls with a fuse. These shells would be fired from mortars or howitzers, arc through the air, and explode on impact or via a timed fuse. The fragmentation effect was devastating. A single exploding shell could kill or maim dozens of men, sending red-hot metal shards slicing through flesh and bone. Survivors would be found with dozens of small wounds, bleeding from multiple punctures, often dying slowly from infection in the days that followed. The psychological impact of artillery was, if anything, even more destructive than the physical casualties. Soldiers facing trebuchets had at least felt they could fight back, could take cover, could do something. Against artillery, there was no defense except luck. You couldn't see the cannonball coming. You couldn't dodge. You simply had to stand in formation and hope the next shot would hit someone else. This created a unique form of psychological trauma. Soldiers would break and run, not because they were cowards, but because human beings aren't designed to endure that level of helplessness. Military discipline became harsher as commanders struggled to keep men in line under artillery bombardment. Flogging, execution of deserters, and brutal punishments became standard, all to force men to stand under fire. The evolution from trebuchet to cannon also changed the economics of war. A trebuchet could be built from local materials by skilled carpenters. A cannon required mines to extract or furnaces to smelt metal, specialized craftsmen to cast the barrel, and chemists to manufacture gunpowder. This meant that only wealthy states could afford effective artillery trains. Smaller kingdoms and rebellious factions found themselves outgunned, quite literally. The rich got richer and more powerful, while those without access to industrial resources were marginalized. Consider the Italian wars of the early 16th century. French kings invaded Italy repeatedly, bringing with them superior artillery. Italian city-states, despite their wealth and military traditions, found themselves outmatched. At the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, French cannons tore apart Spanish and Papal forces. Eyewitness accounts describe the battlefield afterward as a scene from hell, with bodies torn apart by cannonballs, horses screaming with shattered limbs, and the earth churned into a muddy paste mixed with blood. The French won the battle but lost their commander when a stray cannonball struck him down, demonstrating that artillery didn't discriminate. It killed nobles and commoners with equal efficiency. By the mid-16th century, the transformation was complete. The age of the castle was over. The age of artillery had begun. But this wasn't progress in any moral sense. Warfare hadn't become more humane. It had become more industrial. The personal combat of knights had given way to the impersonal slaughter of massed artillery. Deaths that had once been individual tragedies became statistics. Battles that had once been decided by courage and skill were now decided by who had more cannons and better metallurgy. And the impact extended beyond the battlefield. Cities that were bombarded suffered catastrophically. Civilian casualties skyrocketed. In earlier sieges, civilians might starve or die from disease, but they were rarely targeted directly. Artillery changed that. Cannons couldn't discriminate between a soldier on a wall and a family cowering in a house behind it. Entire neighborhoods would be reduced to rubble. Churches, hospitals, schools, none were safe. The sack of Rome in 1527 saw artillery used indiscriminately against one of Europe's greatest cities, resulting in thousands of civilian deaths and the destruction of priceless cultural heritage. This raises uncomfortable questions that echo into our present. Every advance in military technology has been justified as a means to end wars faster, to save lives by making resistance futile. The bombard would end sieges quickly, preventing the slow death by starvation that had characterized medieval warfare. Modern artillery would break stalemates and allow for decisive victories. But each time, the reality has been more complex. Yes, sieges became shorter, but they also became deadlier. Yes, battles became more decisive, but the casualties increased exponentially. The trebuchet might batter walls for weeks. A modern artillery barrage could level a city in hours. As we stand here, looking back across 6 centuries of military technology, the pattern is clear. Human ingenuity, that remarkable capacity for innovation and problem-solving, has been consistently directed toward making us more efficient at killing each other. The engineers who designed trebuchets were brilliant. The craftsmen who cast the first cannons were masters of their trade. But their legacy is measured in broken walls and broken bodies, in cities reduced to rubble and lives cut short. The story of siege warfare from trebuchet to cannon isn't just about technology. It's about power, about how societies organize violence, and about the human cost of that violence. Every innovation created new horrors. Every defensive adaptation was overcome by a new offensive capability. The arms race that began when the first siege engine rolled up to a fortified wall continues to this day, with weapons that would make a medieval siege engineer weep in awe and terror. So what can we learn from this bloody chapter of history? Perhaps that technological progress and moral progress are not the same thing. The cannon was more advanced than the trebuchet, but the suffering it caused was no less real. Perhaps that the human capacity for innovation is matched only by our capacity for destruction. Or perhaps simply that the past was more brutal, more complex, and more tragically human than we usually acknowledge. Here on Ash and Crown History, we don't shy away from these dark truths. We explore the parts of history that are uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions, that reveal the raw reality of the human experience across the centuries. If you've made it this far in this journey through siege warfare, I know you're someone who appreciates history in all its brutal honesty. Subscribe to Ash and Crown History to join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history books left out. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you want to dive deeper into medieval warfare, check out our video on medieval execution methods, where we explore the horrifying ways that societies punished their enemies. The evolution from trebuchet to cannon reshaped the world. It ended feudalism, centralized power in the hands of monarchs, and began the march toward modern industrialized warfare. The walls that fell to those early bombards were more than stone. They were the foundations of an entire social order. And in their rubble we can see the birth of the modern world, for better and for worse. The next time you see a castle, whether in person or in photographs, look at those walls and imagine what it would have been like to stand behind them, listening to the whistle of incoming stones or the roar of cannons, knowing that your life depended on whether those ancient defenses would hold for one more day. That was the reality for thousands of men and women across centuries of human history. We owe it to them to remember their stories, to understand their suffering, and to learn from their experience. Thank you for watching Ash and Crown History. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never forget that the past has lessons for those willing to listen.